Greg.
Hello, Matt.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
So you're up in here doing stand-up. I wonder what your act's like, because you're an actor's actor, coming from the improv world. Well, because the stage is your home. Film must be very different for you.
I like live performing best. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you get the most honest reaction, and I think it keeps me honest as a comedian because you can't fool them all the time.
Mm-hmm. Is it? I wonder the improv mind. Is it always on?
Gosh, I hope so. Especially for the purposes of this interview. It obviously it shuts down sometimes, but I'm usually generally free associating, or jortive, as I just said. Sometimes I use jort instead of sort.
It's okay.
There's no fair guessing when that happens.
What is your act like? What are you talking about? You talking about world circumstances now and?
I talk about politics and being in Canada and Canada and winning the gold medal and all sorts of things. Are you going to come see it?
Of course.
Yeah, okay. Well.
Of course. You've been married 20 years now.
I have been, yes.
I'm sure that creeps up into the act as well.
No, it doesn't. I never talk about my wife. I
Never?
don't talk about my personal life very much. I'm
That's
not a
very
confessional comedian. I mean, there's a lot of comedians that are like, Margaret Cho or people that talk about their own lives a lot on stage, and that's never interested me.
How come?
I'm not confessional in that way. I'm private. You'll get where I'm coming from by the jokes I tell and what I do up there. That's the end of our relationship.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
We'll be very intimate on stage, and then you won't know anything about me after.
That's all right. Well, that's good.
But you'll know a lot, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's never been funny to me, one, to make fun of your wife. Having said that, I adore wife jokes. And it's just not been some way that I was bent. So I would never talk about, comics get up and talk about having kids or being clean and sober and everything, and that's just not for me. I don't begrudge anyone anyone's material, lest another comedian should see this and think, well, fuck you, Greg. But it's just never been where I was coming from.
That's all right. Well, you got your acting. Seems to be working well. Do you remember those first records, or was it records, or was it stand-up? Like, what got you into stand-up?
Well, I loved stand-up records when I was little. I had Bill Cosby, like everybody that's from my generation from the 30s, and we memorized those records over and over. And then, of course, George Carlin in high school, and Cheech and Chong, Richard Pryor. I think it was a golden age of albums in the 70s because so many genius comedians were making albums. Later, Robin Williams, Lily Tomlin. But I'm a fan of all of them. Then I watched old movies on TV, the Marx Brothers and whatnot, and then the Pythons came to America when I was in high school, which was well after they were on in England, but that was very exciting for us too, the non sequitur, abstruse humor that could be conceptual and completely open-ended. And Saturday Night Live came out about the same time. There was something in the air then. I detest the word zeitgeist, and because it's overused and misused, but there was something in the air then that there needed to be more calamity in the comedy, I think, and a little more information and a little more reflection, I think, of what people were about. This took place over a long period of time, but I think the 70s was a big culminating factor. Obviously, when you end up with people like George Carlin and Richard Pryor, who are so explicit about drugs and life and death and sex and poverty, those are the big comedy topics, and not everybody wants to. Not even I will go there all the time. And then later, I think Bill Hicks, when I was a comic in San Francisco. I'm a little older than Bill was, but he was very influential, I think, on a lot of comics because he was so scathingly honest on stage, brutally hilarious about the first war against Iraq, things that no one was touching, and abortion and Jesus and all that. And he was tremendous about that, very funny. And so I've always admired his comedy, too. I saw Bob Newhart in Los Angeles last week. I went to hear him speak. He's 80-something, and he has a new book out, and he was still dead funny. And I adore his style of humor, closer to Stephen Wright, or right now there's a few guys pursuing it, and I'm going to blank on the name, and I'm going to feel like an idiot. He's from San Francisco, Brent Weinbach. Brent Weinbach does a low-key deadpan. Margaret Smith used to do it. Laura Keitlinger does it. I can't do deadpan. I'm not very good at it. I can be a straight man, and I can set up other people. Obviously, I'm a team player, but I love that style of deadpan comedy. where the next thing is a big surprise. And Jake Johansson does it somewhat, that style. Ellen DeGeneres always did.
It seems like you're still a big fan of comedy too.
Oh, I adore comedy, yeah, most of the time. Well, I don't, so I think comics, this is my pretension, and I'm a pretentious guy in some respects. When you're starting, it's okay to talk about anything because you don't know anything. Or if you're really young, you have no experience. You haven't been in a relationship. You haven't lost a job. You haven't fought a fight, and you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Comics who are 21, obviously, they don't have a world to talk about yet, other than the world of the mind, or as big a world. Let me put it that way. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Eddie Murphy was a fairly good comedian when he was 21 years old.
True.
But again, he was only talking about scatological stuff and sex. Mm-hmm. Men tend to talk about their penis to the exclusion of everything else, and that's where I get bored. As a comedian watching other comedians. If you're going to talk about masturbating and watching pornography, you have to understand that the whole world doesn't live alone like you do, and that the whole world isn't interested in that. That there are women and couples and relationships and other things in the world that you can sort of spread out.
And ocelots and things.
And ocelots.
Yeah. So that's not true. You don't actually own one.
I own a herd of ocelots. They're frisky little cats.
Cats.
They'll bite you. They're peppy. Don't turn your back.
Coming from San Francisco must have been not easier in a way to get into the comedy world, but I feel like people would be more open to accepting jokes about various subjects rather than in New York, where they might be harsher to respond.
I think you're probably generally right. I mean, when I started in San Francisco after World War II, it was a boom time in San Francisco. Robin Williams was our Elvis. He was already the big one who'd made it and gone to Los Angeles. But his style, which is based on a lot of Jonathan Winter's style, which is a completely extemporaneous, using the stage as the platform for anything in the moment that you put it right in the act. The thing that him and Winter share is absolute total recall, instantaneous total recall, which is why sometimes you're thinking, what is he doing up there? He can remember everything that he's ever learned and heard and spit it back out in a second. Mm-hmm. So like in the giant Rolodex, if something happens, it goes right to, and within a second, he's coming up with a new idea. There's something of that in the style of San Francisco comedy that I was raised in my 20s. My very good friend who passed away, Warren Thomas, I think was the king of it. We just called it riffing, and jazz musicians call it riffing too. Meaning you start with your material, but then you go right off the rails and try to free associate. And because we're from San Francisco, we're insular and provincial, parochial, self-referential, and tried to be as obscure as we could be at the same time as going as fast as we could. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea was to sort of baffle and punish the audience at the same time as trying to be funny. And I think there was a lot more acceptance of that style of humor there. Mm-hmm. The comics that came out of that era are Jake Johansson, me, Dana Gould, who's a genius. I say that because he came to San Francisco and was in the crucible there. Bobcat Goldthwait was in San Francisco then. I'm forgetting a bunch of people. Margaret Cho, obviously, was just a tiny little prawn in those days. Mm-hmm. She was but 20 years old. And there's an element that everybody shares. And even the later San Francisco comics like Brent Weinbach and I'm bloody blanking on his name, even Arj Barker, whoever you can think of, there's a bit of that sub-referencing. It's a little more abstruse. There's a little more hippie information. Comics from San Francisco tend to hardly ever be fascists. On stage. There's a kind of a political set that comes with it. Whether or not you're explicitly talking about politics on stage, there is a political mindset from San Francisco. Right. A kind of dope-smoking, we love everybody. Mm-hmm. If you don't love everybody, you're an asshole and fuck you. That.
Well, it's fascist in a different way, almost.
It's liberal fascism, and that. So I really believe strongly in that school, having worked with so many comedians then that were geniuses at that. Bob Rubin, I don't know that he does stand-up as much anymore.